I never thought my life would become the kind of story people whisper about in hushed tones, the kind that makes them lean in closer, eyes wide with a mixture of sympathy and fascination. But here I am, 5 years later, telling you about the day my 26-year marriage crumbled and rebuilt itself into something I never could have imagined. It was a Tuesday morning in March when I discovered that everything I thought I knew about my life was a carefully constructed fiction. I had been married to David for 26 years, and I believed I knew him completely. We had built what I thought was a solid life together. 2 children, Emma and Michael, a comfortable home in the suburbs, and the kind of routine that comes with decades of shared experience. David was my college sweetheart, the man who had proposed to me on the beach in Santa Monica, the father who had coached our children's soccer teams and attended every school play. The discovery came through the most mundane of circumstances. I was looking for David's insurance card in his wallet while he was in the shower, preparing for a doctor's appointment we were both attending. Tucked behind his driver's license was a small piece of paper with an address I didn't recognize, and a name written in David's careful handwriting. James, 8 p.m. Saturday. The address was for an apartment complex across town, a place I had never seen before. Something about the way the paper was folded, the care with which it had been placed in his wallet, made my heart begin to race. 26 years of marriage teaches you to read the subtle signs, the small changes in behavior that signal something is different. Over the past 2 years, David had been working late more frequently, taking weekend trips for work that seemed to multiply, and there had been a distance between us that I had attributed to the natural ebb and flow of a long marriage. I stood in our bedroom, holding that small piece of paper, and felt the ground shift beneath my feet. The rational part of my mind tried to explain it away. Perhaps it was a work contact, maybe a client meeting, possibly something completely innocent. But the way my hands shook as I held it told a different story. My body knew what my mind wasn't ready to accept. When David emerged from the shower, towel wrapped around his waist, humming a tune I didn't recognize, I felt as though I was looking at a stranger. How long had I been living with someone I didn't truly know? How many conversations had we had where he was performing a version of himself while hiding who he really was? "David," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. "We need to talk." He must have heard something in my tone because his humming stopped abruptly. He turned to face me, and I saw fear flicker across his features before he composed himself. "What's wrong, Margaret?" I held up the piece of paper. "Who is James?" The color drained from his face so quickly I thought he might faint. He sat heavily on the edge of our bed, the bed where we had shared the 26 years of intimacy, where we had whispered our dreams and fears, where we had conceived our children. The silence stretched between us like a chasm. "Margaret, he began, then stopped. He looked at his hands, then at me, then back at his hands. "I can explain." "Please do," I said, surprised by how calm my voice sounded when my entire world was tilting off its axis. What followed was a conversation that lasted 4 hours. David told me about James, about meeting him at a conference 2 years earlier, about the attraction he had felt and tried to ignore, about the relationship that had developed despite his efforts to push it away. He told me about the apartment they shared on weekends, about the part of himself he had been hiding, not just from me, but from himself, for decades. "I never meant for this to happen," he said, tears streaming down his face. "I love you, Margaret. I've always loved you. But I'm also in love with him, and I don't know how to reconcile those two truths." I listened to my husband of 26 years tell me about his secret life, about the man he had been seeing for 2 years, about the identity he had been wrestling with long before he met me. The strangest part was that as he spoke, pieces of our life together began to make sense in a way they never had before. The times he had seemed distant, the way he had never quite fit into the traditional, masculine roles he had tried so hard to fill. The sense I had always had that he was performing rather than simply being. "James," I said quietly. "James Patterson, our neighbor's son, the one who used to babysit the kids." David nodded miserably. "He's 34 now, Margaret. He's not the teenager you remember." The revelation hit me like a physical blow. James Patterson. I had known him since he was 15 years old. He had been part of our extended family circle for nearly 2 decades. His parents, Robert and Linda, were among our closest friends. James had house sat for us, had joined us for holidays when he couldn't make it home to his own family, had been someone I considered almost like a son. "How long?" I asked. 2 years, David whispered, "since his promotion at the marketing firm. We started meeting for coffee to catch up, and then he trailed off, but I understood. The next few months were the most difficult of my life. David moved into the guest room while we tried to figure out what came next. Our children, Emma 24 and Michael 22, sensed the tension in the house even though we tried to shield them from the worst of it. The family dinners became stilted affairs, the comfortable rhythms of our household disrupted by the weight of secrets and uncertainty. I found myself cycling through emotions like a washing machine stuck on an endless cycle. Anger at David for the deception, for the years of living a lie. Hurt at being rejected for someone else, for something I could never be. Confusion about what was real in our relationship and what had been performance. Grief for the life I thought we had built together, for the future I had imagined we would share. But perhaps the most surprising emotion was relief. Relief that the distance I had felt wasn't my imagination, that the sense of something missing wasn't my failure as a wife, that the growing feeling that we were living parallel lives rather than a shared one had been accurate. David and I began seeing a counselor together, Dr. Sarah Chen, who specialized in relationships affected by late-life sexual identity revelations. She helped us understand that David's journey of self-discovery wasn't a betrayal of our marriage, but rather a testament to how much it had meant to him, that he had tried so hard to make it work, despite knowing, on some level, that he was forcing himself into a role that didn't fit. "Identity is complex," Dr. Chen explained during one of our sessions. "David didn't wake up one day and decide to be gay. He's been wrestling with this part of himself for years, possibly decades. The fact that he built a loving relationship with you, that he was a devoted father, that he tried so hard to be the husband he thought you deserved. That's not deception. That's someone trying to honor his commitments while struggling with a fundamental part of who he is." The turning point came 6 months after the initial discovery. David had been living in a small apartment near his office, and we had been meeting regularly with Dr. Chen to work through the practical and emotional aspects of dissolving our marriage. We had decided on divorce, but we were committed to doing it in a way that preserved our friendship and our ability to co-parent, even though our children were adults. I was at the grocery store when I ran into James. I had been dreading this moment, unsure how I would react to seeing the man who had, in my mind, destroyed my marriage. But when I saw him in the produce section, examining avocados with the same careful attention he had brought to everything since he was a teenager, I felt something unexpected. Curiosity. "Hello, James," I said, approaching him with my cart. He looked up, and I saw my own complex emotions reflected in his face. "Margaret," he said quietly, "I've been hoping to run into you. I've wanted to talk to you for months." "Well," I said, surprising myself with my directness. "Here we are." We stood in the produce section of the grocery store, surrounded by the everyday bustle of suburban life, and had one of the most honest conversations of my life. James told me about his guilt, about how he had never intended to fall in love with David, about how he had tried to end the relationship multiple times because he knew it would hurt me. He told me about growing up knowing he was different, about the years of trying to fit into expectations that felt foreign to him, about the relief and terror of finally accepting who he was. "I know you must hate me," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I thought I would," I replied honestly. "I thought I would hate you both, but I don't think I do. I think I'm just sad. Sad that we couldn't all be honest with each other sooner. Sad that David felt he had to hide who he was for so long. Sad that our friendship got caught up in this deception." James began to cry right there in the produce section, and without thinking, I reached out and hugged him. This young man I had watched grow up, who had been part of our family for so long, who was now part of the most difficult chapter of my life. "I miss you," he said into my shoulder. "I miss our family dinners and our talks about books and the way you always remembered my birthday. I miss being part of your family." And that's when I realized something profound. James hadn't just taken my husband away from me. He had also been taken away from me. The family structure that had nurtured our friendship for nearly 2 decades had been destroyed by the secret they had been forced to keep. We had all lost something precious. Over the following weeks, I began to see the situation differently. David wasn't leaving me for another woman. He was finally accepting a part of himself that he had been denying for decades. James wasn't a homewrecker. He was a young man who had fallen in love with someone who was unavailable, who had wrestled with guilt and conflicting loyalties, who had also been living with a secret that isolated him from people he cared about. The divorce proceedings were finalized a year after the initial discovery. David and I managed to maintain our friendship throughout the process, helped by Dr. Chen's guidance and our mutual commitment to preserving our family relationships. We divided our assets fairly, sold the house we had shared for 20 years, and began the process of building separate lives. But the most surprising development was yet to come. 2 years after the divorce, I received a call from David. He and James had been living together officially for 6 months, and they wanted to invite me to dinner. Not to celebrate their relationship. They both understood that would be inappropriate. But to begin the process of rebuilding the friendship that had been damaged by the secrecy and deception. I almost said no. The rational part of my mind told me it was too soon, too complicated, too weird. But there was another part of me that missed the easy camaraderie we had all shared before everything became so complicated. I missed David's laugh, his terrible jokes, his ability to fix anything that broke in the house. I missed James's enthusiasm for books, his thoughtful questions about my work, his willingness to listen to me talk about my garden for hours. That first dinner was awkward. We met at a neutral restaurant, all 3 of us carefully polite, none of us quite sure how to navigate this new dynamic. But as the evening progressed, something shifted. We began to remember why we had enjoyed each other's company in the first place. David told a story about his new job that made me laugh until I cried. James asked about my pottery class with genuine interest. I found myself relaxing in a way I hadn't in years. "This is strange," I said as we waited for dessert. "But I've missed you both." "We've missed you too," David replied. "More than you know," James nodded. "It's been lonely, feeling like we destroyed something beautiful instead of just changing it into something different. And that's when I realized what had been happening. We hadn't destroyed our family. We had been forced to deconstruct it and rebuild it in a new configuration. The process had been painful, but perhaps the result didn't have to be. Emma and Michael were initially skeptical of my decision to rebuild a friendship with their father and James. Emma, my practical daughter, who had inherited my tendency toward careful analysis, worried that I was setting myself up for more hurt. Michael, more emotional and intuitive, was concerned that I was denying my own needs in order to maintain peace. "Mom," Emma said during one of our weekly coffee dates, "are you sure you're doing this for the right reasons? Are you trying to be friends with them because you genuinely want to, or because you think you should?" It was a fair question, and one I had been asking myself. "I think," I said slowly, "that I'm doing it because I genuinely believe that good relationships are rare and precious, and that just because one relationship ends doesn't mean all the love and care and history disappears. Your father and I may not be married anymore, but we were friends for 30 years. James was part of our family for 20 years. Those relationships matter, even if they've changed." Michael approached it differently. "Are you happy, Mom? Like, really happy? Not just okay, not just managing, but actually happy?" And I realized I was. For the first time in years, I was genuinely happy. Not the comfortable contentment of a familiar routine, but the energizing happiness that comes from authentic relationships. From being seen and accepted for who you truly are. From having people in your life who care about your well-being without expecting anything in return. The friendship that developed between David, James, and me was unlike anything I had experienced before. We were 3 people who had been through something difficult together, who had chosen to work through the complexities rather than walk away from each other. We had dinner together once a month, celebrated holidays together, and gradually rebuilt the easy intimacy that had been damaged by years of secrets. James, I discovered, had grown into a remarkable man. The teenager who had babysat my children had become someone with depth and wisdom and humor. He was working as a creative director at a marketing firm, was passionate about environmental conservation, and had a way of listening that made you feel heard and understood. He was also devoted to David in a way that was beautiful to witness. Not possessive or jealous, but supportive and encouraging. David, freed from the exhausting work of hiding such a fundamental part of himself, became more himself than he had been in decades. He was funnier, more relaxed, more present in conversations. He had started painting again, something he had given up in college, and his work was surprisingly good. He was also more emotionally available than he had been during the later years of our marriage, able to offer friendship and support, without the complicated undercurrents of guilt and deception. Our children gradually came to accept and even appreciate the new dynamic. Emma, initially the most skeptical, began to see how much happier her father was, and how much more authentic all of our relationships had become. Michael, who had always been intuitive about family dynamics, embraced the change more quickly, saying that it felt like we had all stopped pretending and started being real with each other. The real test came 3 years after the divorce, when David was diagnosed with early-stage prostate cancer. The diagnosis was frightening, but the prognosis was good. The cancer had been caught early and was highly treatable, but it required surgery and several months of recovery. Without hesitation, I found myself stepping into a support role. I drove David to appointments, helped him research treatment options, and coordinated with James to ensure he had the care he needed. It felt natural, like caring for a family member, which is exactly what David still was to me, even though our relationship had changed. James was grateful for my involvement, but he was also worried about the emotional burden it might place on me. "Margaret," he said one evening as we sat in the hospital waiting room, "I don't want you to feel like you have to do this. I can handle David's care." "I know you can," I replied, "but I want to help. David is family, and your family too. This is what family does." That evening, sitting in the hospital waiting room, I realized how much my life had changed. 5 years earlier, I had been a wife living a life that was comfortable, but somehow incomplete. Now I was a divorced woman who had rebuilt her life around authentic relationships, who had learned to value truth over comfort, who had discovered that family can be created and recreated in ways that honor everyone's needs and identities. David's recovery went smoothly, and as he regained his strength, our trio dynamic strengthened as well. We began traveling together occasionally, not romantic trips, but adventures that honored our friendship. We went to art museums, attended concerts, took weekend trips to places we had always wanted to visit. We were like a family, but a family that had been consciously chosen rather than assumed. The most profound change was in how I saw myself. During my marriage, I had defined myself primarily as David's wife, Emma, and Michael's mother, the person who maintained the household and kept everyone else's life running smoothly. I had been content with that role, but I had never asked myself what I wanted, what would make me happy, what dreams I had set aside. After the divorce, I had been forced to confront those questions. I enrolled in pottery classes, something I had always wanted to try. I started reading voraciously, joining a book club, engaging with ideas in a way I hadn't since college. I began volunteering at a local literacy center, teaching adults to read, and discovered that I loved teaching. I was considering going back to school to get my teaching certificate, something I had dreamed about but never pursued. "You're different," Emma observed during one of our regular dinners. "You're more yourself. Does that make sense?" It made perfect sense. I was more myself because I was no longer trying to be someone I thought I should be. I was no longer performing the role of the perfect wife, the woman who had all the answers, the person who held everything together. I was just Margaret, figuring out what she wanted and building a life that felt authentic to her. David noticed the change, too. "I feel like I'm getting to know you for the first time," he said one evening as we walked through the park near my apartment. "You're happier than I've seen you in years." "I think I am," I replied. "I think we all are." And it was true. David was happier living authentically. James was happier being part of a family that accepted him completely. I was happier building a life based on choice rather than obligation. Emma and Michael were happier seeing their parents as real people rather than roles they were trying to fill. The 5th anniversary of the discovery arrived on a Tuesday in March, exactly 5 years after I had found that piece of paper in David's wallet. I had been dreading this day, expecting it to bring back all the pain and confusion of that time. Instead, I found myself feeling grateful. I was grateful for the crisis that had forced us all to examine our lives and relationships. I was grateful for the courage it had taken for David to finally be honest about who he was. I was grateful for James's willingness to work through the complexities of loving someone who was married to someone else. I was grateful for my own resilience, for my ability to rebuild rather than retreat. That evening, the 3 of us had dinner together, as we did every month. We didn't talk about the anniversary. We didn't need to. Instead, we talked about David's new painting series, about James's promotion at work, about my decision to apply for the teaching program. We talked about Emma's engagement and Michael's plans to move to Portland. We talked about the garden I was planning for my new apartment, about the vacation we were considering taking together in the fall. We talked like family, because that's what we had become. Not the family any of us had expected, but the family we had chosen to create through honesty, forgiveness, and the decision to value love over convention. Later that night, as I sat in my apartment reflecting on the day, I realized that the story I had been telling myself about my life had been incomplete. I had seen the discovery of David's relationship with James as the end of my story, the moment when everything I had built came crashing down. But it had actually been the beginning of a new story, one in which I was the protagonist rather than the supporting character. The 26 years of marriage hadn't been a lie. They had been a chapter in a longer story. The love David and I had shared was real, even if it was different from what I had understood it to be. The family we had built together was real, even though it had evolved into something unexpected. The friendship we had now was real. Perhaps more real than our marriage had been because it was based on truth, rather than the carefully maintained fiction of traditional roles. I thought about the woman I had been 5 years earlier, the one who had found that piece of paper and felt her world collapse. I wanted to tell her that the collapse wasn't the end. It was the clearing away of structures that had been built on unstable ground. I wanted to tell her that the pain would pass, that the confusion would resolve, that the love would remain even as its expression changed. I wanted to tell her that she would discover strengths she didn't know she had, that she would build relationships deeper and more authentic than any she had known, that she would find happiness in places she had never thought to look. I wanted to tell her that the story she thought was ending was actually just beginning. But mostly, I wanted to tell her that it was all going to be okay, more than okay. It was going to be beautiful in ways she couldn't imagine, complex in ways that would challenge her, rewarding in ways that would surprise her. She was going to become someone she had never expected to be, and she was going to love that person. As I prepared for bed that night, I looked at the photographs on my dresser. There was one of Emma and Michael at Christmas, another of me with my book club friends, a third of David, James, and me at a museum exhibit we had visited together. They were pictures of a life I had never planned, but had somehow created. A life that was unconventional but authentic, complicated but genuine. I had spent 26 years being the person I thought I should be. I was spending these next years being the person I actually was, and for the first time in my life I was exactly where I belonged.